Welcome to the Cultivo Podcast, where we talk about the finance, science, technology, and people building landscape resilience at speed and scale. I'm Sean Leslie, and for our first ever podcast, I'm talking with Cultivo's co-founder and CEO, Manuel Piñuela. Manuel is a business founder and technology entrepreneur with a PhD in electrical and electronics engineering philosophy from Imperial College London. He's a fellow in innovation from Imperial College Business School and the Royal College of Art, and among many other things, an MIT Technology Review Innovator of the Year for Latin America. A true Renaissance man, Manuel is originally from Mexico City. He's lived, studied, and worked in Great Britain, and now he makes his home in Berkeley, California, USA. Manuel, it's a real honor to be talking to you. I'm excited for this conversation, and I am really excited that you're our first ever guest on the Cultivo Podcast.
Thanks, Sean. This is great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Today, we're just going to be talking about Cultivo and what we do, how we do it, why you co-founded the company, and much more. But before we dive in, I'm wondering, what is a book, film, or piece of art that has profoundly impacted your view of nature?
So let me start with a couple of ones. Like with most people that have found passion in nature or any climate related initiatives, I think it's a confluence of many things. But from the artistic perspective, let me take a different take. It has a couple of degrees of separation from nature, but still intertwined. So there is an amazing documentary by Ai Weiwei. It's called Human Flow. And what this documentary covers is just a lot of the variables that come into pushing individuals and then communities and then full countries to start emigrating. And of course, there are geopolitical components on the documentary, as well as all the challenges that these migrants have to go through and how their lives are completely disrupted, is not destroyed. But one of the things that really stuck in my mind when going through this documentary was how land degradation, and not just a geopolitical or a war conflict, was pushing immigrants. And so basically displacing communities. And actually, after a couple of conversations with everything that has happened in the Los Angeles fires, and over the last actually 6 years since I saw that documentary, this has happened more and more, where there are actually climate-related massive immigrations happening across our planet. The one in LA has a lot of different distinctions to it. There's no geopolitical challenge there, but it's the fact that the lives of many, many families have been completely disrupted by the fires. And even though they have the ability to rebuild their homes and in principle go back to their lives, there are many elements about mental health, the lack of having a performing ecosystem, that is disrupting even the wishful thinking to think that their lives can be back to where they were. So again, even close friends are moving away from Los Angeles because of what has happened there. So it just reminded me this very fundamental social construct and why everything that we do at Cultivo is, in many cases, especially when we're working with our landowners, so emotional, because over the last 6 years since the idea behind the napkin of Cultivo, working with landowners has been one of the most complex, but one of the most enriching aspects of what we do in the business. And the emotions that are connected to the land, and of course, in our case, the nature that revolves around this land, is continue to be a dominating factor. And so looking at that documentary, again, was just a great reminder how one big driver of Cultivo's ideation back in the day was just that human displacement that happens when you don't have a performing ecosystem, one that is resilient.
Yeah, but it's been weighing on me a lot too, seeing the fires in Los Angeles and just around the world, as you said, sort of climate refugees, and we're seeing more and more of that kind of stuff. But thank you for that answer. It's always fascinating to find out a little bit about what inspires people like you. And speaking of what inspires you, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what eventually inspired you to co-found Cultivo.
Yeah, happy to. So I've always been driven as a professional individual by a very fundamental driver. On my first day at engineering school at the National Autonomous University in Mexico, where I still remember that first lecture, it just happens to be the first one at 7 a.m., that said, just so we're all very clear, each one of you has decided to become an engineer that effectively will be taking science and physics and apply them, key driver for being an engineer, and apply them to the improvement of human life. And so that has really been a dominating factor across my entrepreneurial journey. So I've been building ventures over the last 19 years, always with this component where my bias is to be taking technology, more and more technology that generates an asymmetry of information and encapsulates that data, that information in a product that solves a problem. From putting street luminaries powered by the sun in rural Mexico to measuring environmental variables such as air pollution and pH soil levels or how a tree grows. But rather than just assuming that someone is going to do something with that data, 15 years ago, in between startups, I worked at an engineering and procurement company in what I would call the start of the Internet of Things and just vast amount of data flowing, where I couldn't believe how sensors were being deployed, but no one was doing anything with that data. And then I discovered that actually the value of data is not on just generating it, but actually the insights that come from them. So that, consider it a common denominator across my ventures. But then as a Mexican, I really experienced land degradation in front of my eyes very vividly. So basically, my grandparents had a house about an hour and a half from Mexico City. Probably now takes 45 minutes to get there. But back then it was close to an hour and a half or two. And it was this lush valley that very quickly went from being a lush valley, dry forests, effectively, dry to temperate forests, and went from being that to being completely logged and turned into rice fields, to then an equivalent of the traditional milpa, which is this mix of corn, beans, squash, to then continue to evolve into pure cornfields, soccer fields, marijuana fields, and then social housing that was never properly used, and now it's a golf course. That's it. There's no more nature there. In something that actually look at night like if you were looking at the sea, it was so dark and you couldn't see the fields. And when there was a pickup truck, you could assume that it was a boat. At least that's what my 5-year-old brain was thinking. So to me, this was this magical world that during the day was land and during the night it was a bay, the sea. And so just seeing the destruction of that and what it meant for my granddad connected to the very lucky experience of having good exit from my ventures, said, well, could there be one next driving function that allows me to dedicate my tool set, that thing that I really like to do on technology and impact, into something that is very close to my heart? And so that really was the formation of Cultivo. But of course, it was also one that I just saw that it captured the imagination of people, let alone my co-founder, James, customers, early employees, and a growing body of knowledge that just wants to and is moving towards this. I really would like to emphasize how I've never been in a situation across this last 19 years where not only the market is pulling us, rather than the typical startup pushing and trying to move a market towards a specific outcome, the market is pulling us, but also the amount of people and talent that wants to concentrate their life into this.
Mm-hmm. Right on. That's a great answer. Cultivo focuses specifically on nature-based solutions. And I'm curious, first, if you can tell us a little bit about what that means. And secondly, why? What has driven you toward nature-based solutions instead of technology-based solutions?
Well, I think I would like to go just 2 steps higher than that. The mission of the company is to accelerate investment into nature with a very big purpose, which is to regenerate 1% of the Earth's landmass. That's about 2 states of Texas combined, or the size of Mongolia, 150 million hectares. So in order to get there, first, we started to do a lot of what is it that we're not going to do. So we're not going to protect and focus our attention on protecting pristine ecosystems, not because we don't believe they should be protected. They have to actually be protected, but there's so many institutions focused on that and actually doing really good work that we wanted to focus on those distressed assets, those that have gone through that personal experience that I mentioned to you. And then as you focus your mind into that, what you're starting to see is that what you need to do is a series of land restoration activities. And I would like to make a distinction that for nature to bounce back, you will need to do a lot of interventions. Some of them will be as the market continues to label things, because that's what we do as humans, right? So nature-based solutions and engineering-based solutions. But we wanted to start with those that were nature-based, but we are continuing to expand the type of activities that we do in the regeneration of an ecosystem to include things that the markets have labeled engineers. So for example, when we talk about biomass removal, and then what do you do with that biomass? Can it feed back the restoration of a plot of land? We will also integrate that type of activity. So more and more, it's just the driving. That's what's so good to having a North Star, because it drives the whole team, the whole technology, and our implementation towards that regeneration. And it will include nature-based solutions as our starting point, but it will also include technology-based or engineering-based solutions. And underpinning all of that is a big, back to where we started, just a big emphasis on the social aspect. So I started to hear more about what social, community, land steward-driven solutions take form when stacked on nature-based and engineering-based solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the social component, I've recently learned how important that is with just making sure it's good for people and their landscape. So that's kind of a pretty high level description of Cultivo. How would you describe it to someone who maybe knows even less than the people we're talking to now about our mission? How would you describe what Cultivo does and what our mission is to someone who's totally unfamiliar with landscape regeneration or the carbon markets or something like that?
Yeah. So back to that mission component, what we started to discover is that there are a lot of financial institutions, our main customers, that want to deploy capital to this space. Why do they want to deploy capital to this space? Because it's just good business, right? There's a return. Of course, at the personal level, as well as an institutional level, there are those additional benefits, sometimes called co-benefits, on increasing biodiversity, increasing water retention, soil health, and of course the ability of capturing carbon by also improving the standing of that community.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just be super direct. It's just a good investment. So from that perspective, what we started to realize is, okay, how can we make sure that more of that money flows into nature, into those distressed assets? And so what we realized, the biggest problem that we were seeing 6 years ago was this false perception that there was no volume, basically no scale. And James and I just couldn't believe it. because more than half of our planet is degraded. So it's the biggest total addressable market you can think of. How come the investors that have been deploying capital here believe there's no scale? And what we realized was that the challenge was not on the scale side. The challenge was on the speed. So money flowed really slowly. So just a couple of key performance indicators there. We interviewed a lot of financial institutions, and they would spend $500,000, if not $2 million, just doing due diligence. And once they've done that, after a year or two, they're still just deploying a bit of capital. Where's the next one? And so that's where our bias kicked in, which was, well, hold on a second. This is perfect because we can speed through that process. This is the crazy entrepreneurial mind. It's like, come on, I think we can tackle that very well, which is let's accelerate that origination, that due diligence, that structuring, that construction of an investment opportunity to make sure that we're hitting not only that speed, but that we're actually leveraging that asymmetry information, again, packaging data in a way that's solving a problem, in a problem being the platform, where we can demonstrate to investors all the things that they're looking for so that they can treat nature as an infrastructure type asset, where they can really understand. They don't need to necessarily be experts in nature regeneration, to your question, right? They just need to understand what are the variables, what is the risk-adjusted return on an investment. And of course, there is the whole construction of what is that capital expenditure, the operational expenditure, how does this generate revenue, what offtakes look like from this investment. And lo and behold, you can actually start deploying more capital and start to give all the signals that investors are looking for. With a very interesting angle here, which was a lot of these investors that are deploying capital to infrastructure type assets, in many cases, they're looking at an industry or a set of opportunities that they had before them that have a lot of conflicts, right? So am I going to invest in a specific type of infrastructure that might be having an environmental negative impact or a negative social impact? Those conundrums, those investment conundrums that are part of the risk pool are not part of nature. So we're starting to also get on speed with those conversations because those are intrinsically not part of an investment into nature. So that's really how we started to speed through at the landowner level. What really drove us in terms of this design was that we didn't want to ask the landowner yet again for them to open their wallet and invest on their whole regeneration, right? They've been asked forever to open their wallets. And of course, it's a prerogative for landowners to say, well, hold on a second, this is a great investment. I'll participate or I will take it all, when they're lucky enough to have not only the physical asset, but also the cash asset.
That's great. It's a great overview. Okay, changing directions here a little bit. I just learned, you've mentioned James a couple times, your co-founder, who's also my boss. And James told me the other day that you were a competitive baseball player when you were a little bit younger.
Well, yeah, although that came to a very quick, so maybe I'll start with the end part. There was a point in, so I think I was 16. And this is when you're just starting to dabble. I had the very privileged experience of being in a baseball camp in the U.S. in the Midwest, where there were scouts from the, if I'm not mistaken, the Braves, the Royals, and the Cincinnati Reds. And you would start conversations. But the super early proposition that I received was, well, you might do really good. And so my position was being a pitcher. I've pitched all my life.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I said, but just so you know, what you will need to do is to start the track. And this is how you progress. There's no assurances that you will be able to make it. Sounds very entrepreneurial, right?
Yeah.
You're going to start to take all of these risks. But a fundamental element for me was, oh, hold on a second, I love playing baseball, but I also really enjoyed learning. So I said, well, and what about school? oh, you need to forgo that.
Yeah.
So I didn't have the knowledge, or neither did my family, that there could have been another avenue that wasn't as striking as that one, right? In the US, there are a lot of scholarships, and I could have applied to a great college and play there. So at that point, to my surprise, I remember coming back. My brother was also in those conversations. He was a second base fielder, and was just really good, super fast. And so we come back and say, hey, look, we just had these conversations, 16 and 14. What do we do? And my parents say, just, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, God, okay. Am I growing, or what was that? That was, I remember very vividly that, given the position to decide on my future. And after a couple of weeks of thinking about it, it was like, no way. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to risk the rest of my life just for playing baseball. Was that a good or bad decision? I think it was good, but that's when I basically stopped pursuing what was my child dream of becoming a Major League Baseball player, and decided to become an engineer.
Seems to have worked out for you so far.
Of course, working really good.
But you still follow baseball pretty closely?
No, not as much as I would love to. It was really difficult to keep up with it in the UK, but now in the Bay Area, yeah.
Excellent.
Much easier. Yeah.
Well, and I imagine your experience as a pitcher helped you as an entrepreneur too. That's a dad joke. Good dad joke.
Oh. No, I thought, well, let me take it seriously. No, seriously, I think as a pitcher, you're taking a lot of decisions as to what happens and what will happen because of your decision in the field. So if you decide to throw a curveball, but you're throwing a curveball against your opponent, and that's what they hit, then you already know that's going to be a hit, if not a home run. And so there's a lot of research, due diligence to be done on the player. So I actually would spend a lot of time speaking to my coaches, understanding what should I be pitching. So it was also a very brainy, that's why I don't think baseball is for everyone, but you really need to understand all of that as a pitcher.
Yeah. Well, they say baseball is a sport for smart people. So you are living proof of that. Okay. Speaking of curveballs, you ready for some tricky questions?
Let's go for it.
Back to Cultivo. Okay. So regenerating landscapes, regenerating nature, that takes a lot of time. How do you guard against landowners involved in a project or land stewards? They jump into a project and then they start adopting non-regenerative practices like cutting down trees for timber or lumber, or clearing the land for non-regenerative agriculture. How do you guard against that?
Yeah. So, well, look, just also to start with the output, we've never had that situation, which is really good, which shows that our process is working. We're building that track record. We have 5 years of building that track record, and the way we provide those safeguards towards our investors, but actually to the landowners, and of course to the business, is that, sure, we have really good and open landowner agreements. So basically a landowner subscribes and basically commercially contracts with a special purpose vehicle that basically governs the land restoration activities that will happen on their land. That's where the capital comes in. That's where the off-takers contract against. But what matters there is that we're very explicit of what are the clauses, the contractual clauses, same as the term that they're subscribing to.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really good is that as we're building towards that contract, call it to the schedules that make the bulk of the contract, it's not only talking about that carrot, what is the profit share that they're going to get, but it's also talking about what are the activities that will happen and that they need to actually bound the practices that are going to be happening on their land. And it's not as part of what is now called the core carbon principles, but where we always started was a full consultation, sensitization, understanding of what are the practices that those land stewards have been doing, co-design what are the changes that should be happening so that those land activities are not only supportive and in alignment with their practices or sometimes their cultural setup, but also that they want to continue to support them for at least 40 years. So by the time that the contract arrives in their inbox, or that we're literally breaking bread over the kitchen to talk about this, or in a full assembly when we're talking with a large community, just to give you a couple of set points, to the most virtual ones where it's all done through a virtual environment, we're always aim to have as little surprises as possible. So in other words, by the time that the landowner is signing that agreement, they already know what they're getting into. They have actually said and had the pen to write many of those items in consultation with, of course, making sure that we're translating what the investor wants and what the off-taker market is looking for. So now that's at the beginning. What we then do is make sure that the practices and the monitoring those practices, the baselines, are always known to all the parties, and that the landowner on a monthly basis, as a minimum, understands where we are in the project lifecycle. And so, again, to minimize surprises, but it's things as human as, hey, I'm going to go to your home. Yes, you said you're going to give me access to your home, call it your ranch, for example, or your forest. I'm going to give you a heads up with a lot of weeks in advance as per the contract to allow us to get there. And you have the complete say of when that happens. And so it's also making sure that the landowner is super clear that their land is unencumbered. Mm-hmm. And so in between those carrots, as well as the stick that has, it does have penalty clauses to do, for example, illegal logging or changing practices, never happens. So that way, the landowner, Cultivo, everyone is invested on the same trajectory and the same outcome. And I think, Sean, that's why we've never had even the smallest of issues of a landowner trying to do those things that we said they were not going to do.
That's great. So that's a good way of guarding against the human element. Humans are going to human and do surprising things once in a while. What about, nature-based solutions are subject to climate risks too. So what happens if, say, one of your projects is involved in a wildfire, or how do you mitigate against that possibility?
Yeah, so let me give you two examples of two very different biomes where we do this. But first and foremost, when we're running baselines, the whole of the analysis that is driven by our platform with a lot of remote, proximal, and ground truth data, all merged and combined through insights coming through our AI platform, we already have a really good context of what are the flood, the drought risk, the fire risks. And actually, in that co-design component, in the project design, we've embedded climatic risk mitigating strategies. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the case of a forest, so we have a couple of projects in the Central Valley of Mexico as an example, to ensure that those forests continue to grow healthily and that all of that investment is there despite already knowing that there is a risk of fires. Then we designed, together with the community and our implementing partner, fire breaks that were conducive to other economic activities. And one that I really love is one where they say, hey, look, can we create a forest trail here that is actually also an amazing downward slope for mountain biking.
Downhill mountain.
So
love it.
That is just, it to me is the convergence of a lot of different drivers, well designed in the spirit of mitigating against those fires so that that ecosystem continues to be resilient from a water, biodiversity, people live there, back to the whole point. We really don't want that community to be displaced because of a fire. But it also created economic incentives to do it well. On the other side, for example, when you're looking at the grassland, it's also about how those rotation grazing practices and holistic management happen so that you're having resilient soils that effectively can capture more humidity, that the small water cycle is performing or starting to perform, that sometimes invasive species are trampled upon or sometimes even removed, and that we're moving water in a way that is also making it a lot more resilient against heavy droughts. Now, so think about then fluctuations that we've seen in some of the neighboring sites of some of our projects, where giving the swings that we're getting this pulsating effect of a lot of water in a desertifying region. And all of us only have very long dry spells. What you get is an abundance of biomass. And so having then corridors of wildlife where there's a mix of wild stock and livestock grazing is also removing the risk of biomass just sitting there, getting dry and then burning. So it's been both effort, and we cannot ascribe everything to what we're doing. As an ecosystem starts to bounce back, we're seeing the super nice flyway effect where all of a sudden wild stock is returning to a specific project, and they're doing grazing in areas that we're not even touching and making the whole site a lot more resilient. So a fire actually started in a neighboring property and never hit our property. We would like to think it's because of all the monitoring that we're doing that actually there is a better performing ecosystem. So resilience is increasing. There's still a lot of data to analyze to make sure that what I'm saying is completely aligned with all of those variables, but time will tell, right? As we continue to make these landscapes a lot more resilient.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So Cultivo is, we work in the voluntary carbon market. And lately, the voluntary carbon market has been getting some negative press, being bashed a little bit in the press. Why do you think that people should still buy credits in the voluntary carbon market? And especially, why should they be buying those credits from Cultivo?
Well, look, I think it's been, from a Cultivo perspective, all the attacks to the market have been in some way. So let me look at it with a happy camper lens here. Is that they really removed a lot of the noise, the bad practices that were happening in the industry as a whole. But as it's now turning after more than 2.5 years of those attacks, that those of us in the industry that are really looking at what the overused term of high quality and high integrity are actually standing up projects that are resilient, that are actually delivering what they said they were going to deliver on paper, and that they were properly designed with all the ingredients that we mentioned. And so the reason of why not only do we see even more, and like many reports that have come out over the last 3 months, a lot more players buying carbon credits, so specifically carbon dioxide removal credits, is because those CDRs are actually starting to demonstrate that all of those pendant data streams, on one, of course, the carbon is still there and will be there. It has actually been captured, but that it has water components or co-benefits to it, it has social co-benefits to it, and biodiversity co-benefits, start to have a direct impact to the materiality that matters to a corporate offtake. In other words, it is a really, and it's still probably the best delivery mechanism of those co-benefits that both connect to the off-taker, the delivery of those co-benefits so that they can report against them. So, for example, a beverage company will have a higher materiality on projects that are capturing more water. Whereas other industries that have other impacts on biodiversity will get materiality on projects that are increasing significantly biodiversity. And of course, all of those that are decarbonizing continue to have those intrinsic benefits from the removal of those carbon tons. And so just overall quality, that's why we're seeing a lot of players moving into the CDR space, both in volume and in and diversity of buyers. But the other one that we continue to see is that there is also a fundamental acknowledgement that the speed of decarbonization, even though, as it's been proven time and time again, those companies that are investing the most in decarbonizing are the ones that buy more credits, is because they really have done their legwork to understand how much emissions do they have, how much they're decarbonizing or abating, and how much they still need to move forward. But there's also this component that there's a convergence happening in between the voluntary and the compliance markets. So airlines are going through it, different other industries are already going through it, or different sectors across the planet are already going through it. And sometimes what there's now a growing acknowledgement is, thanks to all of those attacks, the voluntary carbon methodologies, registries, processes that have a lot of red tape and have become heavily regulated are now in many cases putting the bar as to what compliance market and sometimes in setting markets are looking at.
Yep.
So right now the highest quality bar is starting to look into the VCM space.
That's really encouraging to hear that the quality just continues to go up. And so you talked a little bit about additionality in there. And in that regard, how do nature-based carbon removals compare to tech-based approaches like direct air capture or something like that?
The biggest difference is that it's really complicated to have additional co-benefits in an engineering approach like direct air carbon capture. And so for that materiality component that I mentioned, many corporates are looking into other driving mechanisms for the way they're decarbonizing, and they're looking at their, for example, their scope 3 emissions. They want water components on them. They want biodiversity components there because it matters to them beyond just the carbon. The other one is that nature-based solutions are a lot more cost-effective. So it's relatively frugal compared to engineer approaches to be capturing tons. Why? Because we're relying on technologies that the planet has developed for many, many years to capture carbon. So they are intrinsically very efficient. The third one that is at the biggest difference is that the engineering solutions look at very long durability or permanence. The terms are starting to be mixed. But in essence, when you retire through, for example, a ton of carbon from the atmosphere, you can, if properly stored, have it stored for millennia. Whereas in nature, there is, as you mentioned, intrinsic risk of how long it can be stored. There are ways of mitigating the risk, and you could, in a perfect scenario, make the point that that carbon turned through nature-based solutions will be there for millennia. But it's a bit more complicated to say, here's a bottle of carbon, like you would have on direct air carbon capture. So those distinctions, what I like about where the market is that corporates and buyers of these credits are now looking, as you would in any other industry, at a diverse portfolio, right? So now they have a mix of engineering-based solutions and nature-based solutions that have different time span, therefore terms, that have different strategies per geography, and that they can mix and balance those benefits that they're looking for. So rather than what was since the attacks an or question, do I do nature-based CDR or engineering-based CDR? It's now an and conversation. And then what we're getting is, how do we do that mix? How do I build that portfolio?
Yeah. You talked about carbon permanence there briefly. With our projects, how do we ensure that the carbon is going to be sequestered for a long time? How do we ensure permanence? Effectively, how do you make sure that these projects are durable?
Well, to start with, we use peer-reviewed methodologies that effectively say, if you do X, Y, and Z, for example, in a forest or in a grassland, you need to make sure that by following these practices, that carbon is going to be stored there. So a couple of contractual obligations are going back to how we're demonstrating that all the parties, all the stakeholders are committed to keeping the carbon there. The second one is completely connecting to monitoring, both the practices and that carbon being sequestered. So both on the sampling that call it the biopsies on the soil and the forest to make sure that the carbon has been stored,
Mm-hmm.
but also making sure that those activities are happening. And a lot of the things that sometimes are not spoken about are what are some of those other indicators that demonstrate that the ecosystem is performing and therefore it's also storing carbon.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we go into, for example, soil texture and porosity and what type of insects, microarthropods and others are present.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, how much other types of biodiversity, flora and fauna is increasing. And so all of those monitoring components across multi-variables give you, like in any other investment class, indicators of the performance of your investment. In this case, the ability for that investment to capture carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and keep it there for a while.
It's funny you mentioned that because we were in Seattle this past weekend and we took the kids to the zoo and they were talking about river otters being an indicator species for clean waterways. And so there you go. Okay. You also talked about cost effectiveness. And so this is really interesting to me. How do investors in landscape regeneration projects see a return?
Yeah. So like in other infrastructure type assets, what they start looking at is a financial model, very detailed financial model where, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've digitized and we can run forecasts on all the biophysical attributes of a project. But now we have a vast set of data sets on all the costs that take of all the activities that will be doing that regeneration, that nature regeneration series of activities. And so they're looking at costs, both capital related and operational related, that will include, for example, all the costs of monitoring the ecosystem. And they are then starting to see, okay, so this project has this total costs and it will be issuing these credits, the CDRs, from the sale of those credits. And in many of our projects, more and more, we're having forward offtake agreements that basically say, okay, those revenue streams are not only modeled, but they're also confirmed. So now your risk-adjusted return is you have a lot more visibility of where the revenues are coming from. So it starts becoming an operational excellence question. So now that the due diligence moves into, now I understand the investment, like any other infrastructure class, what's the track record that this company, in this case Cultivo, has of implementing those projects or having exit strategies? So they start getting to the original part of your question. The project, the special purpose vehicle that governs the project, starts getting revenues from the sale of those credits. And the good management of the SPV allows us to have enough cash to operate to hit the break-even of the project and have different types of exit strategies. Those exit strategies could be, depending on the financial institution's investment thesis, could be for dividends and just stay there more from a permanent capital perspective. Or you could be looking as an earlier stage investor that is willing to transition or sell that SPV to another investor downstream. And so looking at performance, I could be speaking about any type of infrastructure type asset class. It just happens to be that the flows come from regenerating nature. But we're basically presenting nature as any other infrastructure asset class so that those flows of capital, both for cost and revenues, are well understood.
Excellent. Great answer. Thank you. A big part of Cultivo's mission is helping local communities around our projects, helping indigenous communities around our projects. How do you make sure that happens as part of the project? How do you make sure they benefit from the project finances and the regeneration of their local landscapes?
Well, it all starts really with our ecosystem of partners that has presented us those landowners. So our platform allows us to basically have a search for where are the properties, those land tracts, or basically tracts of land where we're going to potentially originate a project. And so then our ecosystem of partners, those NGOs, project developers, boots on the ground, allow us to approach them in a way that from the beginning, those land stewards already know that their land is degraded, but they don't know how degraded it is, what will it take, and how much it's going to cost. So the first thing that they're starting to benefit from is just an understanding of that fundamental question, can my land bounce back? So if the answer to that is yes, then it's what is the potential? What is the delta or the spread that I will have at the SPV level? And to your question, the landowner then says, well, am I going to invest in it? Or actually, the way I want to participate is I participate with giving you access to my land, and therefore I have a profit share from that SPV. And then we go back to the financial model on understanding what is the infrastructure that is going to be deployed into my land. So, for example, for ranchers or for foresters, they will receive capital to improve their hydraulic infrastructure, fencing, machinery, wells, you name it. So they, right from the first year almost, they start receiving infrastructure that effectively starts improving their land instantly because infrastructure is increasing in their land. And as they're going through it, they might have commercial agreements as well with SPV to do some of the land activities. So that's also a revenue generating piece for them because they're involved in the land activities. Again, sometimes the landowners are a lot more passive. And the third one, finally, is the profit that they get from the sale of those credits. So once revenues start coming into the SPV, they get a part of that.
Great. So talking a little bit more about what makes Cultivo different, you talked a little bit about our technology. Can you explain more about our platform, our technological platform, and how it helps us achieve speed and scale?
Yeah, happy to. So, look, back to that component on really leveraging the asymmetry of information that happens when you don't understand or when you have an asset class that is complex. So we first start by merging different types of data sets. Sure, open source data sets that were restarted 6 years ago, but as we're developing more and more projects and we're doing baseline pre-sampling across multiple variables, we can then use the data to better inform those biophysical models or those biogeochemistry models to know already quite quickly how that plot of land is going to bounce back and what is the performance that it can have. And as we discussed a bit, what are also the intrinsic risks on that specific plot of land and what activities could be done to mitigate it. So already the platform drives all of those analyses, but what is really exciting is how we're now, even after having so many touch points with customers, driving the insights that go back to that fundamental thesis of it's not just about the data, but how we're packaging that data in a product that solves a pain point. The pain point for our customers is show me all the insights so that I can do a faster due diligence here. Mm-hmm. What is it that I'm not seeing, or what is it that I can see that others are seeing? And so our AI-driven platform is now bringing those insights faster and quicker so that due diligence process also is sped up. We have had so many touch points with financial institutions that we actually know quite well how their investment committees operate, what they're looking for, and we're able to capture that into the platform so that we're serving it faster. And so we're shortening even the decision processes to make sure that that capital is moving faster to the regeneration activities rather than staying in this sometimes eternal due diligence cycle. So therefore, the platform is, and this is where our edge really starts, really looking at upstream origination that is now, of course, mixed with the fact that we have a growing pipeline of more than 250 million hectares that will be used to match against our customers' criteria, investment criteria. Mm-hmm. We then speed through the due diligence process as we're going through all the requirements that we've talked about in terms of both the biodiversity, water, social, and carbon analysis, to then speed through what the project design and the associated costs that will have, to then move even faster through. And this is the other part of how the platform starts to imitate, is that we bring those same insights that the landowner and the investor have seen to the off-takers. More and more, those two worlds are converging in the sense that everyone is looking to answer the same questions. And so we can drive also those insights to speed the due diligence process from our off-takers that effectively when that starts to happen is you have, again, this amazing flywheel effect where timings are shortened. Everyone is starting to understand the intrinsic risks of the project, changing the risk-adjusted return profile of the project, and money flows faster. So the platform really drives all of these stakeholders as a minimum investor, off-taker, and landowner to speed their decision-making so that money starts flowing into the regeneration of that ecosystem.
Manuel, you just mentioned our platform relies on AI quite a bit, and I'm just wondering what thoughts you have around AI in how it can be helpful in the landscape regeneration world.
So the first type of AI that we've implemented is through machine learning. So as we have a vast amount of data sets that we need to commingle and drive analysis through, we're training algorithms to make sure that they are more accurate and precise into forecasting what could be that performance, that spread for those ecosystems. So that's one layer. The other layer is to have the ability through large language models and other types of data analysis to make sure that we're bringing those insights that drive human actions.
Yeah.
Human actions for the intervention, human actions to buy credits, human actions to invest into projects. So it's bringing the insights that effectively a team of humans is going to be looking to deploy that capital either to buy the credits or to invest into the project. So at the end of the day, the result is the same, is that we're shortening the effort, but going deeper in terms of the issues that a project can have so that we surface them faster and we can basically mitigate any risk around them. And then as a project, now let me take you a bit further in the life cycle of a project. Now let's say that the land activities have started. Now you need to start driving a lot of insights that will be used to have a faster due diligence process or a faster auditing process for future off-takers or from even the validation and verification steps that a project will have to go through. So those insights start becoming more and more relevant to more stakeholders. So a big rate-limiting step in the industry since the attacks has been how much validation and verification bodies have had to go through to make sure that they're doing a proper audit. And a lot of that has a lot of conversational elements to it, a lot of data exposure to it. And so that's where it also was a prime target for our artificial intelligence efforts to speed through those steps. So it's really using technology, data, and of course AI to drive from origination tuitions and repeat the cycle over and over again, because back to the point that we have a huge total addressable market to achieve, even though our sum is 1% of the Earth landmass.
Yeah. That's still huge. You started out by talking a little bit about the fires in LA. And a lot of the talk around those fires and the recovery has been around the insurance industry. So when we're talking about making landscapes more resilient, more durable, how would that help lower insurance premiums, or what effect would that have on insurance premiums and why?
Look, and we're doing a ton of research here, but one of the things that the platform surfaces is what is a fire risk and what is a drought risk. But rather than seeing that as a static risk, that can be increased or it can be decreased depending on the health of the ecosystem. And so you can see it in a way, perhaps very tangible to a lot of people, is that some of these insurance companies have had to pull out of certain parts of the planet just because the risk is so high and intrinsic that unless a lot of different variables would change, that risk is high and will always be high. So as soon as a regeneration project starts to happen, but one that is effectively, for example, changing the small water cycle, that is increasing the soil moisture potential, where that fire risk that is there starts to decrease because of the bastion type situation, as in nature-based bastion, that you're changing the intrinsic variables that are present in a specific region where if fire would happen, the ability for that fire to spread is diminished. And so there is a world, but I'm crystal balling here, is that there is a world where if enough land regeneration activities would happen, you're changing, for example, the soil moisture potentially tangibly so that the presence of fire might be the same in the surrounding areas, but its impact and the associated risk, actuarial risks on that land will be diminished to the point that insurance companies can actually be back and operating into the region because now they know that premiums can be actually covered as you're diminishing the risk.
Yep. You told me, and you recently talked about revisiting a project site that you've seen regenerated over time with your own eyes. And you told a great story about how the degradation of that land led to totally unforeseen impacts with the native wildlife population and how that impacted the ranch. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that story a little bit, because it gives you a really tangible example of how landscape regeneration works.
Yeah, so a bit of history here. So in one of our projects, we started the project with all the ingredients that we've been discussing about that co-design. But right after the first 6 months of operations, we started to have a lot of commentary by our landowners that there were an unknown number of black bears, which is a protected species in Mexico, that were eating cattle. Look, since it's a protected species, what you now need to do is to then manage that risk. So the traditional way of managing that risk is one that it's very costly, it's very dangerous, which is you put range riders next to a herd, but that increases significantly the complexity of holistic managed grazing, where you're rotating the herd a lot. So we saw that as a fundamental risk of making sure that those practices were properly implemented. And so we did have to, together with the landowners, do that. So literally range riders with a shotgun, not to kill the bear, but to scare the bear, just in case they would approach it. Okay, so going back in history, when we started this project in the north of Mexico, after about 6 months, the landowners started to have a black bear issue. In a couple of nights, an unknown amount of bears had eaten somewhere around 30 cows.
No way.
That is a significant economic impact on a rancher, right? That can make or break a year. And so the intrinsic risk to the project was that the solution to that normally is, given that the black bear is a protected species, that you put range riders defending the herds all the time. That includes at night. Shotgun on hand to scare the bears because you cannot shoot them. Don't fall asleep, right? You really don't want to fall asleep. And so that just the operational burden of that was through the roof. And we started looking into buying very expensive but beautiful dogs that could help sort that type of problem. For example, in Montana, they use this to fend through grizzly bears.
Mm-hmm.
But all of a sudden, we started to see less friction between black bears and cattle.
Mm-hmm.
But we just didn't know why. And so what started to happen is that we realized after a couple of years, because we also have camera traps across the properties because we're monitoring biodiversity, that we were seeing black bears moving from the low part of the valley to the buttes. Mm. And actually that's where bears normally are or should be. So two things started to happen. Bears started to find more water in those hills. But a very interesting thing is that the time that I visited the ranch, the local cook, gave me this amazing jam with a berry called chapote. And I said, what is this? This is too good. And from being from Mexico City, I knew that the zapote negro, which black zapote, which is like a massive berry. I'm sure I'm completely misrepresenting what the fruit is, but this chapote is like a completely condensed blueberry style and shape and size, but super sweet darker in color, a lot deeper in flavor, less bitter. That just made this terrific jam.
Mm.
And as we're going through one of the paddock visits, one of the range riders says, yeah, and bears eat them all year long. And what was happening, Sean, was that as part of an unknown practice that was starting in the ranches, sometimes those bushes were removed because they were seen as an invasive species. And also what was happening is as the ecosystem was desertifying, those bushes were not getting enough water to actually have fruit.
Yeah.
And so an unexpected consequence of doing all of this holistic management practices around the ranch allowed the bears to eat chapote where chapote was not present. And so far, knock on wood, or after 3 years, those bears are still up there on the buttes.
That's great. That's a great story. And it just shows you how, everything is interconnected, and regenerating landscapes has those knock-on effects, which is great. Okay, so in closing, what does success look like for Cultivo in the next 5 years, 10 years? If Cultivo is successful, when we're successful, what will the world look like?
Thanks for that question, Sean. We're already starting to see success over the last 5 years, but more so in the last year. And for sure, success to us goes from achieving that crazy purpose of 1%, but actually going beyond that. What excites me is that before we just didn't have the ability of creating this pipeline, but just to give you an idea, over the last year, just in the US, we went from having 25,000 acres to having more than 250 million acres of pipeline that we can unlock just in the US. So that is giving me and the team, as well as our investors and landowners, a lot of confidence that we should be able to achieve our purpose and more. So the challenge that we're getting from our investors, board members, is what else are you going to do? And so that's really what excites me, and I hope to be doing this for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I love that. Well, that kind of leads into this next question. What inspires you most about the work that we're doing at Cultivo?
That's okay. So the very personal answer to that is that I can say to my son, because that this other baby that was born at the same time as he was born is focusing on creating this resilience of places that hopefully he will be able to visit that make just the rest of his time in this planet a bit more comfortable and more enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And lastly, what is your parting message to potential partners for Cultivo, for potential investors, for corporations or landowners who might want to work with us? What would you say to them to encourage them to join us in this mission?
That in contrast to the way I was pitching this 5 years ago, we now know what it takes to regenerate nature, how to engage with you, landowner, how to engage with you, off-taker, and of course, how to engage with your investor to put more money to regenerating our planet and having just a really good series of returns across all stakeholders.
Excellent. Thank you, Manuel, for taking so much time away from your very busy days. I know how hard you're working on this project and how in demand you are. But thanks. It's really been a pleasure. And it's been a nice chance to catch up with you one-to-one. That is the end of our first Cultivo podcast. We'll be touching on a lot of the subjects that Manuel mentioned more in depth in future episodes. But thanks for joining us, and we hope you'll come back for much more. I'm Sean Leslie, and thank you again for coming on the show, Manuel.
Hi.